Goodbye to buying cheap products from other companies, said the president's wife, unilaterally declaring contract termination. It was an important client, so I was worried, but then I had a great idea. Understood, we will never deliver to you again. I said this and signed the contract she had brought. Later, the president's wife came back to our company, her face pale with shock. I'm Mia, 37 years old, and I run the company. My company, inherited from my grandfather, is a stable business with many trusted clients. To protect this company and its employees, I constantly study economics and development. We mainly manufacture precision mechanical equipment. Some employees have been here since my grandfather's era, and they know more than I do. I visit the site myself and learn various things from them. My passion has been recognized, and even at this age, I have managed to earn the employees' trust. Of course, I also deal with clients earnestly and passionately. Thanks to this, the company my grandfather entrusted to me has maintained stable performance. But there's still more to do. I need to study more to earn their recognition even further. Then one day, something unbelievable happened at the company. It started with the wife of the president of a particularly important client company. She said her husband had a long-withstanding relationship with our company, but she never knew such a childish girl was running it, saying that the one looking at me as if scorning me was the president's wife of a major company that has had a contact since my grandfather's time. Mrs. Brown stated that today was the day of the year-end party hosted by Mrs. Brown's husband. It wasn't just any year-end party, but a large-scale event gathering all their business partners. It's an annual event, and this year I was invited and decided to attend. As my grandfather advised, I was mingling and greeting various people at the company. Then Mrs. Brown appeared, saying she was representing the president. Mrs. Brown is usually not involved in the management, so this was my first time meeting her. After a brief greeting and introduction and expressing gratitude for the special treatment we always receive, Mrs. Brown said something surprising. I don't know what tricks you use to deceive my husband, but you might end up facing something terrible, said Mrs. Brown. At that moment, I didn't understand the real intent behind her words. As I stood there in shock, Mrs. Brown moved on to speak to another company's president. She was much more amiable than what she spoke with me, and I couldn't help but wonder why she disliked me so much in just that short interaction. Feeling somewhat dissatisfied, the year-end party eventually came to an end. Instead of going to the after-party, I decided to go back to my parents' home to ask about Mrs. Brown. My parents and grandparents live at my parents' home. I often return to my parents' home to consult with my grandfather. Upon arriving, I immediately apologized for coming over so late at night. My parents warmly welcomed me and mentioned that my grandfather was still awake. Hearing this, I headed to my grandfather's room to ask about Mrs. Brown's remarks and character. My grandfather depicted Mrs. Brown as nothing short of perfect, a devoted wife supporting her husband without asking for anything in return with one son. The more I learned, the more puzzled I became about Mrs. Brown. A few days after the after-party, Mrs. Brown showed up at my company. Her unannounced visit surely surprised my employees and secretary. As I wasn't there, she had to wait, which apparently made Mrs. Brown angry. I'm the wife of the president of one of this company's major clients. Do you think it's okay to treat me like this? It's no wonder this company is nonsensical, being run by a childish girl. In my opinion, Mrs. Brown was the one being unreasonable by showing up unannounced, but I wasn't there to say such things. My secretary ended up getting a lecture from Mrs. Brown. When I hurried back, Mrs. Brown had already left the company, but she informed my secretary that she would return another day to apologize properly. Thus, I made an appointment to meet with Mrs. Brown later. When I entered the president's office, I expected to see the president, but was surprised to find Mrs. Brown sitting in the president's seat, assuming a haughty demeanor. I first apologized to Mrs. Brown for not being available the other day. Then I showed readiness to listen to whatever she needed to discuss. What followed was a surprising statement from Mrs. Brown. Goodbye to using cheap products from other companies. For a moment, I was speechless and probably wore a very astounded expression. Seeing my face, Mrs. Brown scoffed. A company run by a childish girl like you can't be trusted. Not to mention, you're overcharging for the products you deliver. I'll be terminating the contract for cost reduction. Her claims was so arbitrary that I strongly retorted I wasn't overcharging. Furthermore, I passionately advocated for the quality of my company's products and explained how they have been recognized and continued by the president. However, Mrs. Brown seemed unwilling to listen. Such arrogance from a childish girl. Disgusted, I asked her if the president knew about this. Mrs. Brown then started saying she was now the acting president and had all the authority over the company. When asked why, she informed me that the president had to go abroad urgently due to issues in their production line. Thus, Mrs. Brown, the vice president, was serving as the acting president. I then realized why the president hadn't attended the year-end party. Tomorrow, I'll bring all the necessary documents to terminate our contract to your company. Make sure you're there. I won't tolerate even a second's delay. When I asked Mrs. Brown for the specific time she would come, she begrudgingly told me. That day, I left Mrs. Brown's company feeling like I was being chased out. This company is an important client for us. Without them, we might not be able to pay our employees. Feeling a sense of crisis, I desperately thought of ways to prevent the contract termination. The next day, Mrs. Brown arrived at my company on time. She sadly placed the documents on my desk and urged me to sign immediately. Please, at least let me discuss this with the president. There's no time for that. Both my husband and I are busy people. Unlike your small-scale operation, we are a major corporation. You should understand as a fellow business owner. I was infuriated by Mrs. Brown's condescending demeanor, such an unreasonable method to unilaterally terminate a contract. Moreover, our companies had a long-standing relationship. One would think she, as a business owner, would understand the betrayal this act represented, but there was no sign of guilt from Mrs. Brown. Frustrated with her haughty attitude, I decided to implement the countermeasure I had thought of all night. As a final confirmation, I asked Mrs. Brown seriously, "Are you sure about this?" Mrs. Brown laughed mockingly at my words. Seeing her reaction, I smiled. "Understood. We will never deliver to you again." Mrs. Brown momentarily showed a hint of caution at my quick withdrawal, but as soon as she saw me sign the contract, she smiled triumphantly satisfied. "Thank you. Now we have nothing to do with each other anymore." Mrs. Brown left looking satisfied with herself. As she walked away, my secretary and I deeply bowed, but inside I was smiling, thinking she should have read the documents more carefully. After seeing her off, I sent a brief email to Mrs. Brown's husband. "Thank you for everything up to now." That alone would probably be enough for the president to understand the situation. Soon after, a call came into my company. "Good day. I apologize for the sudden call. I was surprised to see your email. What exactly is going on? I would like to discuss this matter. Could we possibly meet?" To the president's request, I casually agreed. Yes, that would be fine. A week later, the president arrived at my company looking anxious. Alongside him, Mrs. Brown appeared, her face marked with displeasure. After exchanging formal greetings and small talk, the president quickly asked about the reason behind my email. I led the anxious president to a sofa and offered him coffee. Then sitting opposite him, I prefaced that the story would be long before recounting the entire series of events. I was shocked when Mrs. Brown suddenly announced the contract termination, but I have already signed the documents and I thought it was appropriate to say goodbye to the president who has been so supportive over the years. As I spoke candidly about my frustration, the president turned pale and immediately offered a profound apology. Mrs. Brown, who had come with him, wore a look of surprise. The president, sweating and serious, apologized to me. Mrs. Brown, unsettled by his demeanor, knelt beside him and scolded him in a shrill voice. "What are you doing apologizing to this childish girl? Stop it!" Ignoring Mrs. Brown's protests, the president forcefully made her apologize. Then, glancing sideways at Mrs. Brown, he pleaded with me, "Please, reconsider the termination. Our company relies significantly on yours. It would be a great loss for us." He apologized repeatedly. Mrs. Brown, watching her husband, glared at me with dissatisfaction. "Even if we cut off from the small company, it won't hurt our business. I've already secured contracts with overseas companies to replace it. What's the problem with that?" With that, Mrs. Brown maintained her assertive attitude. I sighed in exasperation at such demeanor from Mrs. Brown. The president, seeing my reaction, was shocked and then furiously reprimanded Mrs. Brown. "You don't understand anything. How could you do this without consideration? We have had a faithful relationship with this company for 40 years. 40 years. Do you not understand the significance of that?" Laughing off the president's words, Mrs. Brown retorted, So what? I don't care about old relationships. Cutting ties with this company will reduce costs and we can lower the prices of our own products. That means we can outdo our competitors. It's all beneficial. The president grew even angrier at Mrs. Brown's words.
It was foolish of me to let you act as president.
The president shouted his regret while Mrs. Brown looked triumphantly back at him. At that moment, Mrs. Brown's phone rang. I'm busy right now, she answered with an irritated voice. However, her demeanor quickly changed to one of panic and confusion. Wait, what do you mean? I had an inkling of what was happening but waited until Mrs. Brown hung up before asking. Is something wrong? I asked. Mrs. Brown, seemingly overwhelmed, started muttering. The products we were relying on from the overseas company have been delayed by 3 weeks and everything that arrived is inferior goods. I couldn't help but laugh mockingly at her distress. That's to be expected. Our precision mechanical equipment has a unique aspect that other companies simply can't replicate. What do you mean? She demanded. It's the craftsmanship, I stated clearly, looking at Mrs. Brown sternly. She looked back at me, still not fully grasping the situation. I took the opportunity to explain just how significant our company's cultivated technology and craftsmanship were. Moreover, our products incorporate unique techniques unavailable elsewhere. They can only be replicated with our skilled craftsmen. As I confidently stated this, Mrs. Brown's face turned to one of frustration and defeat. I held my head high, facing her with a triumphant look. Mrs. Brown, who had been yelling all this time, seemed at a loss for words. Now she was looking down, sulking like a child. I asked Mrs. Brown why she had initiated this whole situation. With a defiant attitude, she started explaining, I want to pass our company to my son, but my husband opposed it and wanted to hand it over to his brother. Apparently, Mrs. Brown's plan was all for her son. She described her son as introverted and not assertive. She had been plotting to set her son up as president, a plan requiring her to take on the role of president in the interim. Fortuitously, a problem arose overseas. Mrs. Brown saw this as an opportunity. With the president away, she aimed to cut off business ties and increase her allies. She kicked out long-standing partners and progressed with contracts she had found, seemingly turning most of the company into her supporters. The only thing left was this place. Without it, my husband's allies would be completely gone. And as an important client, you have considerable influence, which makes you a hindrance to my plans. I thought I had finally found a company that could produce the parts made here and everything was going well until now. Mrs. Brown glared at the president. Seeing her furious gaze, the president sighed in exasperation.
You truly don't understand anything. Our son doesn't want to inherit this company.
Mrs. Brown looked shocked at this revelation. The president, seeing her distress, explained their son's wishes to her.
Our son expressed a desire to pursue agriculture, not business. He wanted to go to the agricultural college, not the economics department. That's why I kept it a secret, as my brother was interested in managing the business.
It can be true, Mrs. Brown whispered.
It is. Look at this,
the president said, showing his mobile phone. There, a message from their son expressing joy at being accepted into the agricultural college and a photo presumably taken in front of the university were displayed. Upon seeing the photo, Mrs. Brown's strength seemed to leave her and she sat down on the floor. The president then turned to me with a desperate plea.
Please, I will spend my life making amends for this incident. Could we possibly renegotiate the contract?
I extended my hand to the president. Well, if Mrs. Brown no longer involves herself in the management, we can pretend the contract termination never happened. The president's face lit up with relief, but Mrs. Brown, looking bitter, glared at me and insisted that the contract termination documents would not be invalidated. I absolutely refused to nullify the contract termination. It was all for my son to become president. Mrs. Brown was clearly being stubborn. I sighed deeply and suggested she take another look at the contract documents. I then asked my secretary to bring the copy Mrs. Brown had given us. Please, look at the signature area. I pointed to a spot outside the designated signature area where my signature was. Mrs. Brown, seeing it, was taken aback. This means the contract termination is invalid, right? I must admit, it was careless of me to sign in the wrong place, but Mrs. Brown, you didn't check it either, so we're even, aren't we? Mrs. Brown remained silent. I then advised her and said, Someone who doesn't thoroughly check contract documents is not suitable for management. With those words, the president hurriedly picked up the copy of the document Mrs. Brown had dropped on the floor, checking the contents and then smiling broadly.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
he repeated. While the president continued his thanks, Mrs. Brown sat beside him, her face filled with regret. Afterwards, I was relieved to have retained an important contract and was praised by my grandfather for securing the future of our employees. However, Mrs. Brown, it turned out, had been doing similar things with other companies, and the president found himself apologizing far and wide. I assisted the president by explaining the situation to companies Mrs. Brown had cut off ties with, offering help. Thankfully, they were willing to cooperate, helping the president's company recover. Due to the ordeal, Mrs. Brown was ousted from the management team, blamed for nearly ruining the company, and faced with divorce from the president. She resisted, but the president, feeling betrayed, showed no kindness. The son ended up with the president, free from his mother's pressure, and continued his studies in agriculture with his own convictions. As for my company, not only did we gain favor with a major corporation, but the story spread, leading to new contracts. Our sales are growing, surpassing even what my grandfather achieved, and the employees are more supportive than ever. I continue to watch over them, learning and growing as the president.